So, hello everybody. This is about using associative memories for signaling object approaches. And you can find more details by looking for preprint on archive.org. So you can use the proper title or my name as a search key there. So why do we care about object approaches? So normally organisms try to avoid collisions, okay? Because usually they imply some damage or they often hurt quite a bit. And so look at this car approaching, and this is one application that would come out of that. So to avoid forward collisions. But how can we get a computer to warn us about collisions? Well, there are two principal ways. The first one is by understanding how the brain does it. So in the brain of many organisms, we find neurons that selectively respond to collision threats. Or if you don't find inspiration, then you can just try out unusual ideas like the one that I will present in this video. Okay, but before we get to the fun part, I have to explain to you two concepts. The first concept is temporal contrast. So why should we care about temporal contrast? Because temporal contrast tells us what changed from one moment to the next in a video. And it is really easy to compute. So we take just two consecutive video frames, like these. Now images are composed of individual pixels at each position. And these pixels have values. These values in grayscale images are called luminance or intensity. So by going from pixel to pixel, computing the difference between the two pixels of each frame at the same position, we arrive at this difference image. And this is just called temporal contrast image, or we call it just temporal contrast. At the right side of the temporal contrast image, you might see the color bar with attached values. These values indicate how big the difference between the pixels is at each position. So you see a lot of gray and some white regions and some black regions. So the white regions mean positive values. This means that the white colored pixels have a positive difference. The black regions mean negative values, meaning that the corresponding pixels have negative difference. And finally, the rest is gray, and this means just the two images do not differ at these positions. When we look at the brain, we find that positive values and negative values go different ways. So the positive values are known as the on channel, and the negative values go by the name of the off channel. This wasn't too difficult, was it? Let's make an example. Here you see the video clip from before alongside with its temporal contrast version. Remember that the positive pixels appear in brighter colors while the negative pixels appear in darker colors. So let's start this. Okay, let's do it again. Did you like it? Hopefully, yes. Here is a summary of the key ideas. Contrast highlights changes. These changes can be in space or in time. Specifically, we are concerned here with changes over time, and we call that temporal contrast. And these changes over time indicate where a movement has occurred. Oh, I forgot to show you how the video clip from before looks like with the on channel and the off channel. So here we go. Remember that in the on channel we find the pixels with a temporal contrast greater than 0, and in the off channel we find the pixels with a temporal contrast smaller than 0. But in the off channel we forget about the negative sign so that the actual values in the off channel are positive. Okay, so let's play back the video. Wow, so again, good. Oh, what I forgot to say is that in this on channel and the off channel, the black pixels indicate 0. And the brighter the pixels, the bigger the temporal contrast difference. What about the information that is encoded by the two channels? Well, the on channel indicates that an object that is brighter than the background moved, whereas the off channel indicates that an object that is darker than the background moved. And now what we are going to do with these two channels. Because the two channels encode movement information across the video frames, they are two-dimensional objects. Again, by looking at biology, we can learn to make life easier. And we can do so by converting the two-dimensional structures into one-dimensional signals. So why should we use the one-dimensional signal? One advantage of doing so is to reduce the energy consumption. So instead of spending energy on 2 times as many neurons as video pixels for processing the two-dimensional signal, we would need just 1 neuron for processing the one-dimensional signal. A further advantage of using a one-dimensional signal is that the computations are accelerated. And what should we do to get from 2 dimensions to 1? Quite easy. We just compute the sum or the mean value across all pixels. And the one-dimensional signal has a new name. It's called the sum of temporal contrast, or SOC, or SOC for short. Now for those of you who love a little bit of math, here comes the formula. Okay? Now we should have a look at the information that is encoded by the SOC. Just imagine the following situation. When an object is getting closer and closer to you, you see it as getting bigger and bigger. Obviously, the physical size of the object remains constant, but in your perception, it appears to be smaller when it's far away, and it appears to be bigger when it's close. Let's have a look at the drawing. The drawing shows an object of size d at 3 different distances from the locus, labeled by 1, 2, and 3. And the fact that you see the object bigger when it's closer is related to the visual angle that the object projects onto your retina. A big visual angle means that the object is close, while when it's small, it means that it's far away. So our perception has to deal with the angular size rather than the physical size. But then we can use angular size to determine the distance to an object. The important point is that angular size and the sum of temporal contrast, or SOC, are related to each other. But first, let's do an example. This example represents the simplest possible approach scenario. We have just a simple white disk that is approaching without any other things that disturb the temporal contrast. Let's have a look at the one-dimensional signals related to the approaching disk. You can see here 3 different curves with different colors. Each of these curves has a different meaning. At the x-axis, we have the time that remains until the collision occurs. At the left side of the x-axis is when the approach starts. And the right side is when we get hit by the object, which is indicated by a vertical broken line. So what do these different curves mean? The angular size is represented by the orange curve. And as expected, when the object is far away, so this is the left side of the x-axis, it's very small. When we move at the x-axis from left to right, meaning that the object gets closer and closer, the angular size curve grows. Now let's have a look at the blue curve, the sum of temporal contrast. You can see that it behaves similar to angular size. So when the object is still far away, it's 0. And the closer the object gets, the bigger it grows. But then a strange thing happens. The SOC curve reaches a maximum before the impact. Why is that? The maximum is reached when the size of the approaching disk is equal to the size of the video frame. Once the approaching disk is getting bigger than the video frame, it generates less temporal contrast. Finally, the gray curve shows how the angular size changes at each moment. It is known by the rate of expansion and can be computed by taking the temporal derivative of angular size. Well, I think you are doing great so far. You just learned how temporal contrast, which is a two-dimensional signal, relates to angular size. And this might be the reason why many organisms perform such computations for detecting collisions. And many researchers use these computations to make sure that their expensive robots do not run against obstacles. So this was the first concept I wanted to explain to you. Now we go to the second concept, which are Hopfield networks. You might have heard last year that, 2024, that J.J. Hopfield received the Nobel Prize in Physics for a computational model of an associative memory. So let's have a look on to how this memory works. If you feel uncomfortable with the formulas, just ignore them. So here we have a memory which contains only 3 items, which are 3 images of the Simpson family. Since an image is a pattern, the memory is also called pattern memory and is denoted by a W in the formula. So what we are going to do with this memory? A memory normally serves to recognize things that we have seen previously. So imagine we see now this image which is missing the upper half. Then by applying an update rule, which is represented by the formula, the memory returns this output image. In other words, the input image was associated with an image in the memory. So in a sense, the memory helps us to recognize a degraded input image. What is very nice. So now let's assume that we store more images into the memory. So now we have 5 instead of 3. We probe the new memory with the same input as before. But do you think that we will get also the same output as before? And the answer is no. This looks a little bit weird. In fact, it doesn't look the same as any of the stored images. So what happened? The more images that we store in the memory, the higher the probability that some of these images are very similar to each other. And this is the point. As soon as the images in the memory are too similar, the update rule is sort of undecisive and does not know anymore which image it should pick from the memory. And as a result, we see a mixture of the memory items. This is the great drawback of the classical Hopfield networks. The drawback is that correlations between the stored items reduce the storage capacity in the sense that we don't get any unique retrievals anymore. When there are too many similar items in the memory, the retrieved patterns mixed up. The other disadvantage is that the classical Hopfield network can process only images that have black or white pixels. This means that there's no way for storing grayscale images into the memory. Fortunately, this problem was addressed with modern Hopfield networks. Modern Hopfield networks allow you to store and process grayscale images. Maybe you have noticed that the update rule has also changed. In a version of this update rule, is also used in large language models like ChatGPT. So let's test the memory. So with this input, we receive the complete and nice output without patterns having mixed. This is quite remarkable, given that the memory now holds 18 items. So far so good, but you might ask, what the fuss have Hopfield networks to do with collision avoidance? And the answer to this question brings us to a new idea of using them for collision avoidance. So here we go. Now the striped disk that you see here is an image that we will store into the memory of a modern Hopfield network. But rather than storing only the disk image, we store a lot of it with different sizes. And additionally, instead of only having one memory, we use two of them, where one contains the original versions and the other one sort of the negative images. The memory containing the original versions is the on memory. The other one is the off memory and contains the negative images. But what will be the input to the network? Well, actually two networks. Quite simple. The video frames. But then maybe this wouldn't work, because before we saw that the update rule always selects the most similar item from the memories. And most video frames don't look very similar to a striped disk, do they? So we need to introduce a small modification. So apart from the scaled disk images, we also store a video frame. But this wouldn't work either if the stored video frame was the current frame. So instead of the current video frame, we store a delayed video frame. The frame that is stored in this example is 5 time steps behind of the current video frame. So what is the idea behind of that? When there's no collision in the video frame, then the most similar memory item would be the delayed video frame, which is retrieved. However, when an object is approaching, then the expectation is that one of the disk images is selected instead. Still, the whole setup is two-dimensional. And the question is how to collapse that into one dimension. The key idea is that instead of retrieving images, we associate a number with each image. The numbers are chosen such that the delayed video frame that is stored into the memories has the smallest number, 1. The numbers that are associated with assumed disk images increase proportional to the size of the disk image. And that's it. Let's see how this works with our video clip. The first image is the video frame. The second image is the input to the network. As you see, it is not exactly the same as the video frame. Rather, the horizontal contours of the video frame are extracted. Finally, the third image represents the network output. The output is here shown just for illustration. Remember that what we are using is not the image, but these numbers that are associated with each image. Good, so let's run that. So the car is approaching, and when it's close enough, you see that the disk image is retrieved. Saw it? Well, I will run it again. So first we see the retrieval of the delayed video frame, and as the car is approaching, we retrieve the disk image. Okay. So let's see how these numbers behave. As before, we have the time on the x-axis, where on the left side we have the start of the video, and on the right side we have the end of the video. The pale colored curves are the raw outputs. The curves that have more saturated colors are slightly smoothed. In more technical terms, the smoothing corresponds to low-pass filtering. So what do the curves mean? The blue curve is the sum of temporal contrast, or SOC. And in fact, it's very nice and smooth and reflects nicely angular size. The red and the green curve are the retrieval indices of the on and the off memory. Although the red and the green curves do not look as smooth as the SOC curve, they are 0, well, better said 1, because this is a retrieval index for the delayed video frame, when the object is still far away. However, when the car is close enough and the disk images are retrieved, the red and the green curves show a sudden increase. Now I want you to imagine the following situation. If you were able to only observe these curves, then how would you decide whether collision is imminent or not? Of course, in this example, it is rather easy to do. So when the red and the green curve are different from 1, then it is time to escape. Now in the memory, we use this striped disk. But you might wonder, can we do better by using a different image? So here I tested further examples with a video clip of the car. The template patterns which I tested are shown on the right. The first pattern is just a plain white disk. The second pattern is a disk with a chessboard. The third pattern is a disk with white noise. The fourth pattern is our default pattern, which is a striped disk. The fifth pattern is a circular disk or concentric disk. And the sixth pattern is a starburst grading, if you want. Finally, the SOC is also shown for comparison reasons. This is the green curve. Observe that all of the test patterns start being retrieved at the same time, which is a little bit more than 50 time steps. But the retrieved indices are not identical for the different test patterns. So how did I select the best one? First, I took a bunch of videos. Then I ran the different videos with the different template patterns. Finally, I picked the one which produced the most consistent results. Here, consistent means that the curves that are generated from the retrieved indices were as smooth as possible, and also that the increase in the activity had to be as smooth as possible. For the car video here, this would mean that the orange curve, the red curve, and the purple curve would be kicked out right away. Now I know what you think, and you're right. What would happen if we used an image of the car for the memory? So I did that. And I did some further simplification as well. So here you see 4 curves. And the simplification I did was to multiply at each time step the on index with the off index. So this proceeding merged the curves for on and off. Okay, the orange curve corresponds to our default pattern, which is the striped disk. The dark gray curve corresponds to the car image, which was centered across the image frame. And finally, the light gray curve is just the car without centering it properly. So as it seems, centering has a huge effect. Because if you look at the curve that is produced by the uncentered car template, you see that it's far less smooth than the curves produced by the centered templates. And as for the centered templates, the smoothest curve is obtained for the car. But the striped disk is really close. And moreover, if you do not know which object is eventually approaching, then you need to use a generic template, such as the striped disk. Of course, if you are looking for a specific object, for example a car, then the best you could do is use the image of a car as a template. Makes sense, doesn't it? Excellent! So now you know everything that you need to know to compare biologically motivated SOC-based models with a new model that is based on Hopfield networks. The biologically inspired SOC-based models are based on what we know about a neuron that is called LGMD, which means Lobular Giant Movement Detector Neuron. This is a very big neuron in the visual system of the locust. An image of the LGMD is shown on the top. It looks sort of like a mushroom, doesn't it? Well, the cap represents the dendritic field, where the neuron receives its input from. So you can imagine that the dendrite is connected to the pixels of an image. And then it sums all this information and transmits it to the cell body or soma. On the top right, you see a schematic drawing of the circuitry of the LGMD neuron. The part of the dendrite colored in green provides excitatory input, while the part colored in red acts inhibitory. I don't want to go much further into the circuitry of the LGMD neuron. Rather, I selected 3 proposals on what the LGMD neuron computes and how it computes. The first proposal is labeled CIS-Phi-19, which is a computational model that was used on a hexapod walking robot to avoid obstacles. The second proposal is labeled FUUP20, again a computational model for the LGMD, but it responds only to darker objects. Therefore, in order to make a fair comparison with the rest of the models, I added a further instance of the same model, which is selective to brighter objects, to the background. Finally, the computational model labeled Advanced was proposed by me and implements the inhibitory circuitry by a self-limiting diffusion layer, and is the first model that uses on and off channels in the context of collision avoidance. Okay, so in what follows, we look at some example videos and compare the response curves of the just mentioned 3 models with the new proposal, which is labeled Hopfield, and the plain sum of temporal contrast, which is labeled SOC. First video. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? This is a small sequence from the first Star Wars movie, where I removed the background. So the 3 objects that are left are the 3 spaceships, which are approaching. Boom. And again. And now we look at the response curves. Remember that what we like to see in these response curves is that during the end of the approach, when the object is getting closer and closer, we look for an increase in the activity. The first curve to scrutinize is the sum of temporal contrast, or SOC for short. And it really looks as it should, because it smoothly increases towards the end of the approach. Next curve to analyze is Hopfield. Maybe it's not so smooth as the SOC curve, but it still shows a sufficiently smooth increase in activity. This is quite amazing in the sense that the template pattern, which is a striped disk, isn't quite similar to these spaceships. Next curve is Advanced. Well, it has some roller coaster shape, going down, going up, going down, but towards the end of the approach, it shows a significant increase in activity. The curve for CIS-Phi-19 looks somewhat noisier and has some dropouts. Of course, we could smooth it more, what would make these dropouts disappear, but in the general tendency of this curve is also increasing. Finally, the FUUP20 curve looks also very nice. So it's low at the beginning and it's getting big towards the end. Of course, this video, in terms of complexity, wasn't very difficult for these models to process. This is because that there was no background movement involved. So we just had an uniformly colored background. But if you have seen the first Star Wars movie, you remember that the spaceships flew through a tunnel, or sort of a tunnel. And the background movement now is quite complex, because it's in the opposite direction of the approach. And again. And now we look at the response curves. Now here things seem to be more complicated. The SOC curve gets very big right from the beginning. This is because the background movement generates temporal contrast all over the video frame. And since there's a lot of temporal contrast all across the video frame, the sum of it leads to a high activity. Next is Hopfield. This looks very reasonable. So it's very small at the beginning and then it kicks off towards the end of the approach. So remember, if we could only observe those curves and would have to decide whether a collision occurs or not, from the Hopfield curve it would be quite easy again. The advanced model is still showing the roller coaster behavior, but at least towards the end of the approach it shows a reasonable increase, which we can easily spot. Now the SysPhi 19 model would not have detected the spaceships in time. Conversely, the FU-UP20 model, despite being SOC-based, shows a nice increase towards the end of the approach. Okay, so we go to the next video. This is an artificially generated video. It shows a drifting grating in the foreground and an approaching disk with a checkerboard overlaid in the background, which is approaching. And here's how it looks. And again. And here come the model responses. Let's start with the SOC curve. As you can see, there's no usable information to evaluate when we look at the SOC curve, because from observing this curve, we couldn't tell whether a collision occurs or not. The Hopfield model does quite well in this situation. Although the response is noisy, there is a pronounced activity increase towards the end of the approach. And it seems to be the clear winner out of this model shootout here. The advanced model shows some noisy responses, but you couldn't tell from observing this activity whether a collision occurs or not. The SysPhi 19 model, well, it shows in the end a small, yeah, here I am response. But of course, you never can tell whether it was noise or whether it's something that's dangerous, like a collision. And finally, the FU-UP20 model prefers not to respond at all. Okay, so if you thought this was the most difficult video because due to the drifting grating, it generated a lot of temporal contrast, we can do something that's even difficult for humans. So look at this new video here. So maybe you don't see anything. And here we have a noisy background, so white noise that is changing all the time from image frame to image frame. And the approaching object is a uniform gray disk. And it is even hard for humans to tell whether there's happening something here or not. So let's run the video and you can compare yourself. So again, and another time. And now let's have a look at the response curves. Okay, the SOC curve is overwhelmed by the temporal contrast that is generated by the white noise background that is changing from one time step to the next. The Hopfield model is noisy, but it at least shows an activity increase towards the end of the approach. This is quite spectacular in my opinion. The advanced model, there's nothing really usable here, nor in the SysPhi 19 model, and nor in the FU-UP20 model. Oh, and by the way, the curve labeled with a red theta shows the angular size of the approaching disk. This is how the ideal response should look like. Good. So we are done. So what can we say about using Hopfield networks for signaling objects approaches or even detect collisions? So yes, surprisingly, it works. And it works very well, so that the performance of the Hopfield model is comparable to state-of-the-art SOC-based models that were inspired by the computational circuitry of the LGMD neuron of the locust. And finally, some acknowledgements. So, the video with the car and the video with the Star Wars sequence was kindly provided by Claire Rindt. And believe it or not, she showed locusts the Star Wars video, and the locust could detect the object approach. And the second acknowledgement goes to the Spanish government. They provided financial support for this research. So thank you very much. And the last thanks goes to you for listening to this video and hopefully also for looking at it. This is all for today. Have a nice day or remaining day or whatever. Take care and goodbye.